Welcome to Dialogue Out Loud, where we explore the intersections of Mormonism, current events, and scholarly thought. I'm your host, Margaret Olsen Hemming, the co-editor of Dialogue, and today I'm honored to welcome William Davis, the author of one of the articles in the new summer 2025 issue. It's titled Joseph Smith's Spiritual Language, The Presence of Early Modern English in the Book of Mormon. William Davis is an independent scholar with a PhD in theater and performance studies from UCLA. He is the author of Visions in a Seer Stone, Joseph Smith and the Making of the Book of Mormon from UNC Press in 2020. William, welcome to Dialogue Out Loud.
All right, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to jump right into this conversation about your article. For those who haven't read it, would you please give a brief summary of your thesis and your arguments?
Yeah. So in Mormon studies, there are two camps of thought regarding the nature of Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Mormon. And they are given the terms that Royal Skousen had come up with back in the 90s, where there's a translation process known as tight control and a translation process known as loose control. And so the debate is between these two theories. Tight control, just to read how Royal Skousen defined it, is the theory that Joseph Smith saw specific words written out in English and read them off to the scribe. And the accuracy of the resulting text depended on the carefulness of Joseph and his scribe. So in other words, tight control means that Joseph Smith, he didn't actually translate any part of the Book of Mormon, but he simply read the words off the surface of whatever translation instrument he was using. And so essentially he was a transcriber, but the text had already been translated by someone else, and it was being fed to Joseph through the translation instrument. And in a recent interview, Royal Skousen said that he believed it was the Lord that did that translation. But other people have suggested that maybe it was angels, or it could be the seer stone itself as a translation object had provided that. Loose control, on the other hand, is the idea that Joseph Smith did, in fact, do what he said he did, that is, translate the Book of Mormon. So in other words, he would receive however that came to him, either through visionary experiences looking at the seer stone, or somehow the seer stone prompted visions that he then articulated the text of the Book of Mormon using his own storehouse of linguistic knowledge. And so that the language was Joseph Smith's, and so he performed just as other translators would. Just so in order to speak the text, he had to use the vocabulary that he knew, the grammatical structures that he knew, his linguistic variety. And so my paper comes in, and I'm saying I'm coming down on the side of loose control. And I'm saying I believe that Joseph Smith is the source of these words. And as part of this paper, what I'm looking at are some of the evidences that Royal Skousen and Stan Carmack have used to try to claim that this could not have been Joseph Smith. And I'm using some of those same exact examples to show how, well, in fact, depending on how you interpret the evidence, you can also see an alternative and equally valid interpretation of the evidence actually strongly points to Joseph Smith as the source of the language of the Book of Mormon. So that's what the paper's about.
So in other words, Skousen and Carmack have perhaps taken this evidence maybe too far for your comfort in understanding exactly where the language, where the translation happened.
Yeah, I wouldn't, and then again, when I say to say too far for comfort, I mean, we just have to go where the evidence
Mhm.
points us. But I guess what's ironic about saying where the evidence leads is where our interpretation of the evidence
Right.
leads and what we find the most compelling. And so I think what's happened is ultimately when you see evidence and when you interpret the evidence, there's always a human element. It's not always an objective, well-defined um, outcome. You always have human beings who are involved in the interpretation. So I'm a human being. I look at the evidence. I look at the interpretations of the evidence. And ultimately, it comes down to a personal opinion about what I feel is the best explanation for the evidence that's in there. And so, and that would be the same with Royal Skousen and Stan Carmack. They have been looking at the text and they feel that their interpretation of that evidence points in a totally different direction. And it's one of the things that comes up in the interpretation of historical evidence or even just data sets and analysis. Two people can look at the exact same evidence and come away with polar opposite interpretations. And so what I did is I looked at some of the evidences that Royal Skousen and Stan Carmack have used, and I tried to say, we need to pay attention to another valid interpretation that's not being addressed here. And when we do take those things into account, it looks like the stronger interpretation is that Joseph Smith produced the words.
Interesting. So you use the word idiolect in your article.
Yeah.
Could you explain that term for us,
Yeah.
and also why you use it or how you use it in your arguments?
Idiolect. So when a person grows up and they're in their community, so I grew up in Provo, Utah, and so I surrounded with English speakers. And so as I'm growing up and I'm learning the language, I'm kind of learning what everybody else around me. So when I go to church, when I go to school, when I'm reading books, and I'm picking up the way everybody else is speaking the language around me. And so in the larger language family, I'm learning English, but if we wanted to even narrow it down further, I would be learning certain types of pronunciations, even certain words that have a different definition than what they might have. If I heard someone say soda, I would think of any kind of carbonated drink where someone who's growing up down south might hear soda and say, "Oh, that's definitely Coke" or something. Or there are similar terms where, we come across these words where if you lived in Seattle or you lived in Florida, they use it a different way. And so that's when you start to get into dialectical differences. So you have English as a main language, and then there will be dialects, also regionalisms. But then when you go down to the level of the individual, so you have an individual person growing up inside this language community, and they are going to learn the language in their own unique and idiosyncratic way.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens, and just to give you an example of when we start to see how someone maybe makes a mistake in the development of their language. So during the process of learning language, and we call language acquisition, someone, for example, when I was growing up, I used to read a lot. And what would happen to me is sometimes when I'm reading a book, I would come across a new word and I didn't know the definition of that word, but I was too lazy to go grab a dictionary. So the way I learned the definition of the word is just by looking at the context and having kind of a general feel of what that word meant. Now, the problem is sometimes the context is too ambiguous to give us a clear definition of what the word means. And so sometimes, and this is just one example of different ways that people learn a word, but it's not quite right. So based upon, in my idiolect, my individual language, and this is me in my experience and my version, my personal version of English, I may have learned a word that was incorrect. And so when I go out and I'm speaking with other people, some people might say, he didn't use that word quite properly.
Mm-hmm.
That's an example of how my idiolect developed in such a way that I have, a word or possibly even a phrase that just wasn't correct. I'll tell you one that is kind of falls along this example growing up in Utah. If we have the phrase, I took it for granted.
Okay.
Now, when I was growing up and I was a kid, what I heard in the Utah dialect is, I took it for granted. And so when I was in grade school, I took it for granted. And I thought, well, what does this mean? I took it for rock solid truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only as I got older, I realized, oh my gosh, it's not granite, it's granted. It's something that was just assumed. So that's an example of how someone with their idiolect can grow up and learn something that's incorrect, or they're reading a book, they assume a definition that's incorrect.
We
And
have
oh yeah.
one in my family in which my sister read a word in a book that means mistaken, and she thought it was pronounced as mizzled. And so for years, she used the word mizzled to mean mistaken. And it wasn't until she was a teenager that she realized it was misled. But by then,
Oh,
our whole family had adopted the word mizzled, and we still use it sometimes. And of course, it's not a real word, but within our family, we use the word mizzled.
oh, that's a great example. That's because what happens so like these words, and when someone has this word, they then, when you see that surface in a text, and I'll give an example. In the Book of Mormon, Royal Skousen pointed out how there is the word retain. In the context of the story, it's where some fighting has been going on. The Lamanite leaders had delivered up their swords because they were captured. And then they said, we're going to stop fighting. And then the Lamanites said, we're not going to stop fighting. And so the Lamanites retained their swords to keep fighting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they'd already given them up. So retain is being used the same way as retake.
Yeah.
Now, the important thing about that example is, and Royal Skousen has done a ton of work. And I should say, by the way, all of these things we're talking about, I couldn't have written this paper without Royal Skousen finding the things he did. So even though I'm taking a different position from Royal Skousen, I do want to let people know that I'm standing on the shoulders of a giant, and that's Royal Skousen, in order to even make this commentary. It's because of his work. Anyway, going back to retain, so what happens is, according to Royal Skousen, that definition for retain has never appeared anywhere in English at any time. Now, normally in linguistic analysis of a text, if you come across someone using a word that has never been used that way at any other time in the history of the English language, the first thing you go to is, oh, this person learned the word incorrectly. And but somehow that isn't the why we're not then looking at Joseph Smith then and saying he must have used this as a mistake. Because if we're going to attribute that to the Lord, that I would think that the Lord would have a mastery of
Okay.
English in all its forms and all its ages, and the Lord would not make that kind of a mistake. So to me, and my way of interpreting the text is that this is a human error, and given that what are our options, the divine or the human, I'm going to go with the human being the source of that error, and therefore Joseph Smith. And that, so for me, that is an example of one of Royal Skousen's examples that for me does not point to tight control, but definitely points to loose control.
Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
that's
great.
example.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what this argument means. First of all, you argue that this debate over tight and loose control and whether Joseph Smith functioned more as a tool or as a actual translator, transcriber versus translator, you suggest that his translation reflects human limitations, or that it hinges more on interpretive lenses more than the evidence itself. So how do you see scholars' assumptions shaping their conclusions in this debate?
Well, I think kind of going back to how scholars, there's that human element,
Mm-hmm.
and from what I can see, I mean, this is an example where people, as they're gathering the evidence and analyzing the evidence and coming up with interpretations, that entire project eventually points them into one direction or another. I think there's always a risk. And the risk is, and this is the human element, is that when we reach a point where we start to become convinced of one outcome,
Mm-hmm.
there can start to be a bit of tunnel vision for that single outcome. And so that alternatives either never come to mind or they're summarily dismissed as inconsequential or unimportant. And we can see this, in any kind of historical interpretation or data analysis, that when people start favoring a particular theory and they become committed to it, and then when you start throwing into things such as human ego and wanting to be correct and et cetera, then you can really start to see the blinders coming on and a determination to stick with a particular theory. And that's just human. But I think what's happening then is that there are certain assumptions that start to get built in the further down that road you go. Assumptions towards Joseph Smith participating or not participating, and those simply get reinforced more and more over time until people are really determinedly in one position or another.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just one of the dangers of not staying open and being willing to look at evidence that contradicts one's own cherished theory and try to step back and make an impartial judgment of what's happening. That's hard, and there'll never be agreement on a lot of stuff, but I think that's what's going on.
Yeah, yeah. So it feels like, even though it seems like a fairly small difference in definition, this actually has really pretty huge ramifications for how we think about many things in the church, including prophetic authority and the nature of revelation. So if Joseph Smith's translation work reflects human limitations, including linguistic mistakes, then how does that reshape our understanding of his role as a prophet, um, the nature of, the role of prophet in general, and the nature of revelation?
Okay. That's a great question. It's one that actually is quite important. at least for me, when I think about this issue. Now, first and foremost, when I look at this, I look at the evidence, I look at the interpretations of that evidence, and then I'm making a determination of what I feel is the best, most accurate interpretation of that evidence, and which, of course, leads me to loose control.
Mm-hmm.
What are the ramifications of that? Well, when we look at the text of the Book of Mormon, and when we find these moments of human error or human mistakes, what that tells us, to me, what that tells us is that prophetic utterances, what you have basically is you have this divine message, something that God is wanting to communicate to a prophet.
Mm-hmm.
But you have this omnipotent, omniscient, divine being trying to send a message down to a fallible mortal prophet. And so this unfathomable divine message is having to be funneled down into something that a human mind is capable of grasping. And so what's going to happen with the prophetic utterance, the utterance is then going to be a reflection of what that human prophet has in their mind, their ability to articulate this message. And the reality is there are going to be limitations with the language. There might be concepts or ideas in the divine message that simply cannot be expressed fully in all their nuance and all their glory in the English language or any other language. So what that means is the divine message and the human message, there's always going to be slippage. There's never going to be an exact translation of that divine message into the human language. And so when we recognize that there's always some slippage, there's always a little bit of wiggle room, that means that prophetic utterances will always be subject to clarifications, qualifications, revisions. And of course, I think that's one of the important things that the church has is this concept of continuing revelation,
Mm-hmm.
so that if a message comes down to a prophet, the prophetic utterance, is the best that that prophet could do with his time, his cultural place, his concepts, his ideas, that maybe down the road it needs tweaking and revision in order for people to understand more clearly what the message was meant to be, or to even understand how in that process of the human articulating a divine message, that there could be issues with the ability of that mind to fully capture what exactly the message was.
Mm-hmm. Right.
In application, we can then talk about things in the past of where, like the discrimination against the Black community in the church. We can start looking at things that were once doctrine, things that were considered doctrine, started out as a tradition, moved to doctrine. But in the course of that, there are a lot of prophetic utterances and also a lot of arguments, scholarly and maybe pseudo-scholarly arguments trying to define or
Justify.
defend.
Yeah.
And that's when we can realize, when we look at this, we can say, there are certain things that needed to be revised. And so it opens the door. When we can look at the text of the Book of Mormon, then we can see the traces of the human fingerprints on that language. Then it gives us a little bit of information on how divine messages get translated into language. And that slippage that occurs there, it opens a door for us to then be able to make revisions, to have continuing revelation, to fix mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's critical. And that's why for me, when I look at it, that if we embrace tight control, and look, if I felt the evidence pointed to tight control as the best explanation, then you go with it. I don't think it does. But if we stuck with tight control anyway, then all this information about prophetic utterances and how they're contingent, how they're coming from fallible prophets, all of that information that we learn that will help us to improve and grow and develop gets thrown in the trash.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the consequences, one of the dangers down the road that I see with what that is. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll stop there because I can keep going on that one.
um, I think you're spot on here, and just really quickly, specific to the Book of Mormon, how does this change perhaps how you read the Book of Mormon, or how you think we as a people should read the Book of Mormon? Because this is really different from something we often kind of boast about in the church, or take great pride in, is like, we have this set of scriptures that is perfect. Unlike the Bible, which has been through this process of translation, and we say it's true as far as it's been translated correctly. What does that mean if the Book of Mormon is true as far as it's been translated correctly?
Well, that phrase is exactly what we go with. Recognizing that as far as it's been translated correctly. So there might be moments when Joseph Smith, in the articulation of what he was receiving, maybe didn't quite capture exactly, precisely what that divine message was trying to say. And why? Well, he grew up in the early 19th century. There's certain concepts, ideas, use of vocabulary that he would not have been free from. So that message would have been filtered through his mind and his conceptions, his linguistic storehouse. And so I think it's important then to recognize how, and I'm thinking, for a great example of this is Grant Hardy in Understanding the Book of Mormon. He's talking about how when you look at the messages that are in the text of the Book of Mormon, but we recognize that prophets are people too,
Right.
then we can see how the way that Nephi talks about his brothers is definitely Nephi's point of view about his brothers.
Right.
And so that allows us to kind of step back and say, is there something that Nephi is not telling us? And it doesn't even have to be that he's hiding something, but recognizing that a prophet and what they say, what Nephi was saying about his brothers, is entirely dependent on Nephi's perspective. But what would Lehi's perspective
That's right.
on them be if we could see Lehi's record? Or what would Sariah's perspective be? It's kind of like when we talk about how there can be 4 different people standing at an intersection, there's a car wreck that happens, and every one of those people will have a different account of what took place. You'll have overlapping commonalities, but there will also be differences. And it's because so when they have their different perspective on what happened, that they have because of where they were positioned in relation to the event. The same thing's going on with Scripture. Then we can step back and say, this text was written by human beings, and they're giving things according to their perspectives. And so we always keep that in the back of our mind, that are we getting the full account? Well, oftentimes we're not. We're just getting one slice of the account. And so that's one way to look at text then, is to recognize there's more going on that we need to think about.
I love that. And I think what you're inviting readers to do is to see actual, much more complexity in the text. And instead of feeling like that's daunting or scary, maybe we can, really see the I don't know, the interest that comes with that. So, thank you for sharing your insights on this important topic. It makes me interested in going through the Book of Mormon again and thinking about where Joseph Smith's fingerprints might be. And also, as you described, where Nephi's fingerprints are. And I find that quite inspiring. So for those of you who are interested in reading or listening to William Davis's article, Joseph Smith's Spiritual Language, The Presence of Early Modern English in the Book of Mormon, you can read it or listen to it at our website, dialoguejournal.com. We invite you to delve into it. And thank you again, Dr. Davis, for coming on the podcast today and sharing your insights about your article.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Greetings, my name is Rebecca DeSchweinitz, and I'm thrilled to serve as a board member at the Dialogue Foundation and as one of the hosts of Dialogue Gospel Study. In each episode, which we record live the second and fourth Sunday of every month, we welcome esteemed speakers from a variety of backgrounds to share their insights and perspectives on the Come Follow Me lessons. Our aim is to spark meaningful conversations about the scriptures, to connect them to our personal experiences and to our understandings and explorations of the gospel. To stay in the loop with our upcoming lessons and this opportunity to engage with Mormon thought, culture, and belief, be sure to visit dialoguejournal.com and sign up for our newsletter. By doing so, you'll receive updates and timely links to join our live stream lessons. Additionally, you can catch up on our past guests and episodes by subscribing to Dialogue Journal on YouTube, Facebook, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Dialogue Podcast Network.